I think I should start. Yeah. Hello and good evening, and welcome to our second webinar in our monthly program in conjunction to the exhibit at the Henry Sheldon Museum in Millbury called Artists in the Archive, Community, History and Collage. The exhibit was curated by Rick Cassini-Cadur, and we are presenting this program in collaboration with Collage Live Online. I would like to acknowledge that we broadcast this program from Dakina, the ancestral homeland of Abenaki people, known now as Vermont. My name is Eva Garcelon-Hart, and I'm archivist at the Stewart-Swift Research Center at the Sheldon Museum. And last spring, we invited a diverse group of artists from across the United States and several other countries to look at our collections and create artwork commenting on the concept of community. Community as it was, community as is, and how hopefully what it should be. Today's program will be focusing on absences, erasures, and omissions in archival collections, similar hours and collections probably across the country and the world, which we are re-examining more and more nowadays. So a little background. Our collection basically was assembled by our founder, museum founder, Henry Luther Sheldon, during the last few decades of 19th century, and then it was added by subsequent generation. Henry Sheldon was a local man whose ancestry reaches white settlers from Connecticut, and he had certain frame of mind how to collect. He really amassed amazing collection and documenting his community very well. But during his lifetime and afterwards, it turns out that Millbury was actually not as homogeneous as it appeared or can be seen in our collection, because we had number of people from different regions coming and living here, and our historical records can confirm it. For example, we don't have very good documentation of native populations from Vermont, Abenaki populations, and people who basically were the earliest community here. We have a number of collections in our archives and museum, but they are not really accompanied with any sound scholarship or interpretation. And we frankly, and often they are basically categorized as Indian relics, which says by itself what I mean by that. And so little is known about local native population and obviously individuals. The same goes for people of color. They lived here, but majority of our records are basically pretty derogatory, racist advertisements, minstrel posters, and very few really documents which focus on individuals or community as such. Also Jewish population. Right now we have a thriving Jewish population in Millbury and surrounding area, but we have one collection which is fairly significant in our archive because it documents business of local Jewish family for several decades, but nowhere in our catalog we use a word Jewish. So unless you know, you wouldn't be able to come across this collection. Another group, we had here a number of European immigrants. For example, Italians work here in marble works and in railroad industry and many others. there is very little documenting these people, their lives or community. And then I also wanted to mention presence or lack of presence of people of Asian descent. We know that these people live here, probably not in large numbers, but there were individuals who made living here. And regrettably, we invited one artist whose name is Yang Shin, who is of South Korean descent, artist from California, who produced one of the collages. She wasn't able to be here, so I would like to present a little bit about her work, and because it's really fits very well with today's subject. Yang was looking at presence of Asian Americans in our archival collections, but we couldn't really come up with very specific examples. They were scattered objects and images. And we found, if I may please see the first slide, the image which shows a main street in Middlebury at the end of 19th century. She was attracted to this image because it shows the store China Hall. She did a lot of research in our local newspapers and turned out that this store basically was selling crockery, French china, bird cages, lamps, and everything in tinware. At the same time, also local newspapers were were publishing articles which were not particularly flattering description of Chinese culture or Chinese people, and Yang described it as, quote, America's relationship to China was one of intrigue and repulsion. So if I may ask for a second slide, Henry Sheldon actually collected across the board, and he collected for exotic sort of aspect of items. So he obviously was very intrigued by Chinese script. This is his label, first Peking Gazette, supposedly. There is, in his word, a Chinaman's New Year card on the left, Chinese prayer book. But he clearly didn't collect it to learn or to convey anything in depth about the culture. And next, please. We also found in our collection, this is a proof of Chinese people living here and receive mail and doing business, because we have these receipts. And obviously these receipts are attesting of people of Chinese descent living here. And next, please. This is what Yang came up using all these materials, compiling it into this collage. We also had some materials in our museum collection, like some china with Chinese scenery and this clock. So she put together all these, assembled all these items. And I will quote to finish that from her label, how she describes her work. America's relationship to China was one of intrigue and repulsion. We found that just, oh, I'm sorry. I'm quoting not the right thing. I layered such images and then stripped and ripped them to signify the erasure of these people in our community, in this community. Lastly, goods imported from China and likely traded and sold in such stores like China Hall indicate this heartening but unavoidable fact that the products from China were readily accepted while the people from the same regions were not. So that is Yang's work commenting about Asian population here. And finally, I would like to, so thank you for the slides very much. Thank you for that. And finally, I would like to briefly introduce our panelists in the order of appearance. The first speaker is Carmen Lizardo, an artist who is from Kingston, New York. Carmen was born in Dominican Republic and immigrated to United States at the age of 19. She spends a number of years as academic, and now I understand she's full-fledged artist full-time. And in her words, she's interested in immigration, race, transmutation, memory, and identity. She will be followed by Ginger Sedlarova, a Canadian artist who from Barnaby, British Columbia, right next to Vancouver. So she considers herself a collage artist and a storyteller. Ginger and I shared Central European roots, and just recently Ginger's work was on display in the museum in the city of Prague. Thirdly, Jillian Hartke, my colleague by profession. Jill works as a digital archivist at Albuquerque Museum in New Mexico, and she manages a collection of over 150,000 images. We share together, I think, some struggles and interests in bringing attention to unknown hidden parts of local histories. And you can watch her highly effective photo podcasts on YouTube where she promotes these collections. And I provided links to all these wonderful individuals as part of the biographical part on our website. And following the presentation, my absolutely wonderful colleague, Taylor Rossini, who worked with me during the early parts of preparation for this exhibit, so she's intimately kind of familiar with all these materials, who right now is in graduate program in Maryland, Winter Tour graduate program. She graciously agreed to lead a Q&A session. So please feel free to type your questions, and I finally pass my voice to Carmen. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Carmen, and I focused on the absence of people of color in the museum. We were able to find one photograph of an unknown African-American woman, which I used to populate and take over the spaces in the museum. So I worked with interior images of the museum, and I used those images to focus that woman and place that woman into different objects and spaces. And I used to do that. I printed on some transparent materials, some silk, and I projected the images of the museum as a three-dimensional space because I really wanted her to live there onto the silk, which it had an image of the woman floating. And that's how I was able to obtain the images that I was able to obtain. It was really important for me that it was environmental, that it was not a flat surface, but it was really existing in time and space and sort of breathing with the work. Even though it ended in a two-dimensional piece, the experience for me, the performance experience aspect for me was very important. So I can connect myself emotionally and physically with these images, so I can understand what I was making them. I know that seldom when we think about spaces and places, they're also connected to memory, and which carry love or the opposite of that, and many different other sentiments. But when there is an absence of something, it's very scary because there is nothing. And when there is nothing, there is no cultural connection, and there's no spiritual connection. And then there's a loss of identity that happens. And it's impossible to speak about identity without speaking about race. right? Because it's all part of the one package. And when that lack of race doesn't exist, or a lack of group of people does not exist in the community, or exist in the community but are not represented within that community, those group of people are not just they're not just not appearing in certain places, but they're actually physically and mentally removed from the society group that exists there, thus reducing that group so small. Even if the group is big, if there's no representation for that group is so small, and the group becomes self-inclusive, so they don't share because they themselves don't think that certain things are of value, even though they're valuable, because no one ever told them. And I know in my experience that that is true for me. I have to find my own ability to understand what things are valuable that came from me and my culture and my American culture that I have adopted. I think of the margins between the presence and the absence of something, and that breathing space, the crack of invisibility that exists there, but also the room where there's light shining through that crack. And what I wanted to do was to create a situation in which this woman was undeniably present. You could not ignore her. She was in every single space that I have access to, and I have access to digitally, and it was fascinating to me and annoying to me at the same time. I was doing this work, and I was kind of doing it pissed because I only have this one picture to work from. And then I realized this is not a picture. This is an icon. This represents something so much more bigger than this one photograph. And if I make it into something that actually is the representation of a cultural group of people that belongs in that space, because it lives in that space, because it breathes in that space, and because I actually saw it, I saw it moving and I saw it breathing, it became a reality that I can actually then frame in a piece of paper as an actual document of the existence of these people, and the existence in an iconographic way, in the way that we have religious iconography, even though that was not my intention. My intention was to find how to connect something culturally and spiritually to ancestry, because to me all of those things are connected. And I did enjoy the project so much. I learned so much from it. I learned about the question how to place absence in a shifty cultural terrain that we live in today. How do we deal with that as a group of people that want change or want to have more access to culture, and how we can address those issues in a way that is productive and in a way in which we feel is fair and honoring certain part of the community. In the picture that you have in front of you is called Monument, and I saw this beautiful clock, and the background and the paper really attracted me to it, the decorative aspects of it. This woman was given to me the portrait of it without any decoration. She was very plain. It was a black and white photograph, no particularly aesthetically present, but I saw the face and I saw the clock, and I wanted to create a monument of her looking at you while you're looking at her, and the time that it passed really signified to me that idea of permanence in this work. right here are a picture of flat files and pictures of where documents are, very precious documents and very old documents are safe. And I really wanted to put her in there because she deserved to be a precious document. And I wanted a nostalgic sort of view on this next pictures and this one because I wanted to speak about this past, and I wanted it to know, I wanted people to feel that sense of longing and that sense of beauty also that is historically present for so many people, but is also so isolated from the mainstream of American history. And that's why I made these in a more nostalgic way, in the way I colored them. This is her inside chimney, and she to me, and she's in top of a chair too, that's in front of a chimney. I found that interior picture really engaging, and also I wanted her to be part of that sort of fire, and she's still looking at you, and she feels she's looking at me as I look at her, and it's to me a really important thing in the relationship that we have to experience in order to recognize this woman, this unknown woman. This is one of my favorites, called In the Spine, and it's a book. It's the spine of a book. I also love the pattern, and I found actually I found a second woman, or we found a second woman. It was sent to me by Eva, and she was kind of lost amidst other things, but I was able to recuperate some of the face and the hands, and I really wanted to put it right in the spine. And it was also alluding to our column and our spine as a center of strength, and also how is the center of strength in a book, and alluding also to being in books and being represented in books with such beauty, with such classical pattern and such beauty. That was my idea when I did In the Spine. So this one is one of my favorites because, and the last one I did, because I really thought that, well, she's now at the door. Now she's seen inside the museum, and she's also seen outside the museum. And I also have to go through that door to enter the museum and to enter the space. I think, to me, this is very allegorical in this place of accepting, of acknowledging, of really making a point. I think that to acquire or have or make, you have to be brave, not to make the image, but to receive the image. I think at the end, for me, making the image is the easy part of the equation. The hard part of the equation is how do people react or accept these things as a part of their own culture, as part of what they're missing in their own lifestyle, in the way they live, in how things are changing. But there were times in where they were there too, they are there too. So the change is really not so much that we're growing, we are observing, and we are accepting. So what happens if we take a museum with lack of representation of this particular group and we turn it into something that is the museum of this particular group? And that's what my idea with this this next slide. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, hello, hi. I'm going to be speaking a little about my process of how I dealt with the lack of representation of the Middlebury, the early Jewish community. So again, Eva already introduced me, but hello, my name is Ginger Sedlarova, and I'm a collage artist in Burnaby, BC. And so I applied for this residency because I was about to start a long-term collage project based on my own Jewish ancestors. And I've always been interested in history, and I wanted to learn more about research techniques and archives for my future projects. So this residency seemed like the perfect fit for me at the perfect time. So at the beginning, first I began to consider various themes for my project. They included concepts like early forms of grieving or collage based around the town's musical heritage, but those ideas were forgotten like as soon as Eva mentioned during one session the history of Middlebury's Jewish community. You already know Jewish history excites me, so I was intrigued, especially when she mentioned that there were tons of archival images on this topic. Hang on, Eva. So, except there wasn't. During the next session, I mentioned how interested I was in working with all those archival Jewish images she'd mentioned. And that's when I discovered that I'd misheard Eva. She actually said that there was very little Jewish history in the archives. So, oops. So I went back to those original ideas, but they just didn't excite me as much as the local Jewish history. But pursuing that Jewish history really worried me, because at this point, I only knew of one image in the archive, this postcard that showed Middlebury's main street and a Jewish store as part of it from 1928. And also the idea of working with a single or very few images was completely foreign to me at the time. I'm used to working with like a giant pile of images for my collages, but who better to try and represent than people who aren't represented? And I do love a challenge. So when I started researching, the name Harry Lazarus immediately showed up, and his connection to Middlebury was just too strong for me to ignore. So at this point, I had one postcard and nothing else. So I started reading and reading and reading, and I went straight down a rabbit hole of Harry Lazarus until I felt like I knew him. And I'm going to share my screen with you now and walk you through my process. Okay. So then I started my collage, right? I still had this tiny, blurry 1928 postcard as my only image, but I had to start somewhere, right? So I removed the Lazarus department store from that postcard from the rest of the image, and I enhanced it as much as I could, trying various colors before landing on this vintage gold. And I also spent hours bringing out the name of the store on the side of the building that you can see there at the bottom right. That was not fun. And so I didn't have much, but I did still have Main Street, Middlebury. And I know Lazarus absolutely loved his community, so I decided to create a street scene of Harry Lazarus, except I had no photo of Harry Lazarus. So what can you do when someone is absent from an archive? I found an image of a Jewish man walking hand in hand with a child, and I thought, how perfect. Lazarus and his son Eugene walking towards the family store. I turned the image into an outline, as you can see, and I added some texture, but they looked really generic. And I needed to make this feel like Harry and Eugene. So I leafed through like more than 100 digital images of the Middlebury Register from the early 1900s. And I added a few of Lazarus's store ads that I found to these outlines. And I also found a 1921 notice of Harry's name change from Lizardo to Lazarus to make his shape truly his, all about him. So now I'm getting somewhere, but my collage it's half empty, and I didn't want to just fill it with images without meaning just for the sake of filling it, right? I asked Eva and Taylor for some vintage maps or anything they could think of. Plus, as Eva mentioned before, the Sheldon Archives have 6 boxes of papers in their collection from the Lazarus department store. And I absolutely love working with handwriting as an image. So I asked Eva if she could look for some of Harry's original handwriting. And she found a handwritten ledger page you can see there, as well as a vintage map of Middlebury from 1886, which you can see in the background now of the collage. And there was also a Middlebury address label on this invoice from a trip Eugene had taken to New York City in 1954. So I added the address label to Eugene's outline. Eva also found an image of Eugene from that same trip. And so I finally had a photo of someone in the Lazarus family, but it was a photo of Eugene as a grown man. So that's when I realized the outlines of Harry and Eugene were from the specific period around 1920 or so. We know the postcard is from 1928 and the map is from 1886. So to me, why not extend the timeline of the Lazarus family's history visually? So now Eugene, as a grown man, was waiting for his father and younger self outside the store. These images, they felt to me as if they were like reaching out to each other across the years. It felt good, but something else was still missing. Really important. The Lazarus family were devout Jews, and at this point, the only sign of their religious devotion were the shawl tassels hanging from the outlines of Harry and Eugene. So a Star of David may seem rather obvious, but I really liked how it floated over Harry as he walked. It's almost protective of him. And the gold connected it to Harry's store, which linked 2 of the most important things in his life besides his family, Judaism and his store. The menorah was for me because I love them and they evoke a strong connection to me and my family's between me and my family's Jewish past. While the blue postcard sky made the scene feel even more like the start of a new day for the Lazarus family. So I still wanted to show a little more of Harry's connection to Middlebury. So I added some more ad text I'd found in those newspapers. So there you go. At this point, it was a matter more of composition, not image selection, which was really good because there weren't any more images. I thought long and hard about what to title this collage, and I came back to a Jewish saying I'd encountered at the start of my research, and that's, "May their memory be for a blessing." And it refers to the continued blessing a person leaves behind from their good works, from a life so well lived that the goodness should continue to flow after they're gone. So here you can see the title in Hebrew. And there you have it, the process of my finished collage. I mean, of course, it didn't come together quite as easily as this, but we only have so much time together today. And it never would have come together at all without the help of Eva and Taylor. So thank you both. And I'm just going to stop screen sharing real quick and finish up. So I'd also like to say that when I make a collage, I always visualize an audience or person in my mind who I'm making that work for. And in this case, that audience was the Middlebury Jewish community, many of whom were really helpful to me in my research. So my hope is that my collage is properly represented a part of their community's history and that I've done them proud. And to Harry Lazarus, may your memory be for a blessing. Thank you.
Ginger, please now. Thank you so much. And Jillian, please. That's wonderful.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Can do it. Go. So just to sort of recap, I am the archivist, the digital archivist for the photo archive collection at the Albuquerque Museum in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The connection to the Collage Institute is that I also worked with a group of artists in looking through the photo archive of the Albuquerque Museum to create collages and artworks inspired by the things that the artists found in the photo archive. And in going through that process, we had to really I had to really dig deeply into what the strengths of the collection that I care for are and what the weaknesses are. The artists, you know, as you can see here, the artists come from all over. And so many people who I was working with had never set foot in New Mexico. And so their experiences were interesting, and trying to talk with them about what stories the archive can't tell and what ones it can, and then trying to figure out ways to come up with opportunities for the artists to really feel that they were successful in creating. So I'll just kind of go over a little bit of what we had in those conversations. So the strengths of the photo archive, there's 150,000 items within that department. Railroad history, Albuquerque had, the railroad arrived in the really early 1880s. It really is the reason that we have Albuquerque as it is today. But we did have two different distinct communities. We had Old Town, which is much, much older than New Town, which is the railroad, sort of the railroad depot, and it's grown into what is now downtown Albuquerque. So the photo archive tells a lot about railroad history. It tells a lot about New Town and that downtown area. Portraiture, we have a lot of portraits. Route 66, of course, the Mother Road is a big topic for the West, but especially it goes right through Albuquerque. Much of Albuquerque also grew because of tuberculosis. We had a lot of people who arrived in New Mexico seeking treatment for chronic illnesses, mostly tuberculosis. And white Hispanic families of the upper and upper middle class are very well represented in the archive throughout all of those themes, but also just in general, we have a lot of sort of their collections that they held for their families are in our archive. And then let's see. There's also weaknesses, of course, and in that instance, New Mexico has a very large, in comparison to the rest of the country, a large Native population. Our Indigenous history, though, in the photo archive is not particularly strong. It really does vary, though, by what pueblo or what tribe you are looking to find in the archive. In terms of our Black community, we had a very strong community in what's called the South Broadway neighborhood of Albuquerque, but the representation in the archive is really hit or miss, and it's mostly, I would say, unidentified. So it's again kind of, how do you tell an individual's story if you don't have the names to kind of build the foundation of stories? Queer history as well. That's an area where we are trying to get at least contemporary images, but it's not very strong. Women's history is also really not very strong. Like for the entire history of New Mexico's women's suffrage movement, we have 10 seconds of a parade right down Central Avenue, and that's it. Immigrant community history, it really depends on what particular community you're looking for, but it's not, I wouldn't call it strong. It's still a weakness. The Albuquerque Museum's photo archive actually began in 1978 as a collecting department, even though the museum is about 10 years older than that. And it wasn't until about 4 years ago that the photo archive department became truly its own department within the museum, where it's got, as a digital archivist, I was able to start going out and trying to acquire things to sort of fill these gaps that I saw in the collection. Prior to that, it had been part of the history department, sort of as a sub-department within the history department. And there's a problem with the collection in that it sort of just goes off a cliff around 1975. They did not focus on collecting representation of communities that were like less than 50 years old. And so we've really struggled a little bit with getting more contemporary representation in the photo archive. So that's also something that we're working on. Photographers of color is also a weakness. And then we do have particular neighborhoods are very well represented within the archive, and then some are just completely absent. And so we also have that. And this sort of builds upon sort of what Carmen was saying. We do have portraits of communities that I would say are not very well represented in the photo archive, but most of our portraits are unidentified. And so I think sometimes when we're talking about absences within the archives, I sometimes think of it in terms of like levels of absence, in terms of like, okay, I have examples, you can see people, but I don't know who they are. I don't know their stories. And so they're not fully visible. Even though you might be able to find some images, I think there's still questions of visibility, even if you find representation, because how much do you know? How much can you find out about these particular images? And so these are two examples from a photography studio in town, taken in the 1890s, and we know the photographer, but we don't know who either of these individuals were. And so I think that's, to me, even though you can see them and you can find them, they're still a little bit obscured in the archive. And then when you talk about completely absent, for us, it really is, we have very little on the communities of people with disabilities in our city. And despite having a branch of the New Mexico School for the Blind and Visually Impaired, and we've had that for about 50 years, there's really nothing in our archive to speak to that community. This image here, this is a 1945 photograph of the Veterans Administration Hospital that we have in Albuquerque. And so we have maybe 10 or 12 photographs of that particular post-World War II time. And you can sometimes see people in there who are recuperating or who are learning to sort of deal with whatever may have happened to them, but we don't have very good representation beyond that time period. Also in Albuquerque, we have an organization called Mandy's Farm, which is an organization that is, I guess, I'm not sure, the term is maybe like adult daycare kind of things. It's like daycare for adults, and they actually come to the museum once a month. We see them all the time, and so they're engaging with the museum without us ever actually being able to have their stories within the collection. So it's something that we're working on and that we need to work on. And then also Special Olympics New Mexico is housed here in Albuquerque, and again, it has since the 1970s, and we really have nothing on that community. And so this is really like, there's really very little visibility at all. This photograph here that I'm showing you, and then this photograph here, these are honestly about as much visibility as I have of communities of people with different abilities. And this one, though, I did want to say, when we're talking about this topic, I think it's also good to try to think about how do we navigate that, and how do we sort of remediate the situation a little bit. And in this case, here we're trying to do reparative cataloging, and that can be done in this way, in this particular instance, this is a photograph of a woman. It was a street photography exhibit that we did a couple of years ago. This is a photograph that was taken on Central Avenue, which is Route 66. It goes straight right through the middle of town. This was taken in 1969 by a street photographer who was hired actually by the museum to document the city at that time. It was just before urban renewal kind of came in and really changed a lot of what the downtown part of Albuquerque looked like. And so it's a glimpse at sort of what Albuquerque was downtown. If anybody knows, Albuquerque downtown is very, very different than what it was in the late 1960s. And this particular woman, and I guess I'll say, so street photographers also tend to have a tendency to be more of an observer. They don't typically ask for permission to take photographs. They typically don't get identities of the people that they're capturing in their work. They like to kind of blend in, and that's the case with Walter McDonald. He would just sort of roam around and then just sort of click and move on. So the photographer had no idea who these people were that he was taking pictures of, but this particular woman stood out, and she stood out not only because she's selling pinon and gum, and as it turns out, she was always there at that corner. That was kind of her spot. She was just sort of a fixture, I guess, of downtown. And as the show went up and people started to see this particular photograph, everybody started, like on the internet and with different social media, people started saying, I remember her. We used to always go and we would buy from her, and she was so nice and all this, but people didn't know her name. And so what we did is, in an attempt to try to make her more visible, and in our cataloging, is we highlighted this as sort of one of the iconic images of that particular exhibit, and it wound up on TV and in the newspaper, and her family came forward and told us that her name is Sotela Garcia Jaramillo, and they told her, they shared her story with us. We were able to find actually where she's buried in town. We were able to learn so much about her, and in that way, she becomes more visible, right? She's not just sort of this person who just sort of what people remember but didn't really know. Now we can tell who she is, and so I'm hoping that through sort of crowdsourcing and that kind of thing, archives and libraries and museums can try to use a collective knowledge and try to if not close these gaps, at least make it more of a concerted effort to get some people and some stories shared. So Sotela is one example of how we've tried to do some reparative cataloging. And then another example is we have a current show right now that's a portrait show. And there's 17,000 portraits within this collection. And what's very unique about this one is that Brooks Studio was a studio that was in Albuquerque from the 1920s to the early 1940s. We have the untouched negatives and then retouched portraits. So in many cases, our individuals, you see kind of what they look like, I guess, realistically or like in person when they walked in, and then you see this sort of retouched, idealized beauty version of the photographer's idea of what they could look like. But in this particular instance, also almost all of the photographs were identified, but they were identified by the person who paid the bill, not necessarily the person whose picture, who's the subject of the portrait. And so in this case, you see, this is a woman and a child, and the identity given to that is James Cole. What we were trying to do in this case, in terms of reparative cataloging, is track down the names of the women. It was particularly important that the women, especially in this case where so many women, their faces were completely unrecognizable after the retouching. It felt like not only were they being erased, their faces were being changed, but their names also were not visible within the collection. So what we did is we used Albuquerque city directories, and we took the names that we could find that were written on the negatives, and we tracked down, to the best that we could, we tracked down the women's names. So this is Barbara Cole. She was married to James Cole. This is their child. And so in this way too, we're trying to bring some visibility to people who have been erased. That's really all I have to say. So I'm going to stop sharing, but thank you for listening.
All right. Well, before we get to the Q&A, I want to say a little bit about how exciting I found this project, both for myself personally and for the Sheldon Museum. Because I think when we're thinking about absences in the archive, first of all, every archive, every collection has its absences, but there's a point at which the kind of established tools of the historian or the archivist kind of fail when you're thinking about these absences. You know, we can dig deeper, we can research more, we can kind of look in the margins of these absences, but at some point things are simply not there. And I think what was so exciting about this project was that the collage artists who we invited to join us weren't limited by these kind of conventional tools of the historian or the archivist in the way that we were. And so they were able to create these incredible interventions in our collection and kind of revive some of these historical figures who we don't have physical, visual representation of. And in Carmen's work, she was able to physically occupy the space of the museum with these two women of color. Ginger was able to create this incredible visual genealogy of a family who has very little visual reference in our collection. Young was able to kind of call to attention this tension between objects from China, but people from China, and the acceptance of one, but the exclusion of the other. And so all that to say, this was incredibly exciting, I think, for both Eva and me. It proved that contemporary artists engaging with historical collections is an incredibly fruitful and exciting thing. I think Rick Cassini-Cador is, the incredible archetypal example of this. This is what he does with all of his projects. So all that being said, we do have a few questions in the Q&A. The first is for Ginger. And the question is, does your collage always involve so much thought and research, or was that particular to this project?
Wow, okay. Off the top of my head, it always involves so much thought, but not necessarily so much research. I mean, historical, to me, it's, as someone who worked on newspapers and studied journalism, getting the facts right is paramount, right? So if I'm dealing with real people who really existed, not just people I'm creating out of a variety of images, I'm definitely going to do my best to get the facts right. And so that can take a lot of research. Whereas if I'm doing something a little more lyrical, fantastical, surreal, it's not quite so important, but still, it's my work. I think about it a lot. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Ginger. Let's see, we've got another, and I would encourage all of the panelists to read through some of the comments in the Q&A as well, because there have been some very kind comments. This is a question that is open to any of the artists who are with us tonight. I'm curious how this experience differs from the majority of your work, in that you were responding to a particular place and a particular collection, and a collection and a place that you were never able to physically experience. So I'm wondering if any of you would like to speak to that.
I feel a bit like a bit of an idiot. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, you know, I imagine that a lot of your work is shaped more by what you're interested in at the moment, what kinds of visual materials you maybe have encountered recently or particular themes. But in this situation, you were presented with a very specific place and a very specific collection. And I'm wondering how that might have changed your process of creating the work for this. Was it exciting? Was it challenging?
Okay, exciting and challenging for me. I can't speak for Carmen, but I'm sure she would agree. But it was daunting because up till then, I've been able to choose my own images, and all of a sudden I had I had to work with you guys, right? I couldn't just go into one of my books or magazines here and find something that would fit into here. So daunting, challenging, but an incredible learning experience. Something that I would like to repeat a lot in the future, because I think that it's again, I love a challenge, and that's what this was. And having to work within boundaries, within limits, is something that I'm quite used to from previous careers. And so I enjoyed it. I didn't expect that. It was scary, but I ended up enjoying it because it may be, okay, you have to work within, you can only work with Eva and Taylor and what they've got, but at the same time, you can then kind of push those boundaries, like Carmen and I both did. She ended up taking, putting these women directly into the archive where they belong, which I absolutely loved. And for me, I ended up creating a sort of a day in the life of. So it can expand your boundaries rather than how it feels like you're working within a box, but then you just have to open the box. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ginger. And Carmen, feel free to jump in if you'd like, but no pressure. So another question for Ginger. Terry says, thank you for your beautifully lucid account of your creative process, and is wondering if you considered including Lazarus's wife or other women as representative of Jewish womanhood within the town of Middlebury historically.
Yes, I did. I actually, Harry's wife Stella came up quite a lot, but only as his wife. I know that she helped run the store. I know a few details about her. I know she birthed his 4 children. I know a bit about her earlier life and how she was the daughter of a rabbi, but there's 2 things. One is, I don't know, there just wasn't written history of the women back then, as we all know. I certainly didn't find a photo of either of them, but definitely I don't know where Stella is. And the other thing is, I only had a few minutes, so I kind of edited her out of my talk. So she did come up a few times originally, but yeah, there's just not enough information on her for me that I could find for me to add her to my presentation, my collage.
Yeah, well, thank you. And a question for Jillian. Can you say a bit more about how your museum's photo collection began? Was it in association with the university? Was it a private collection? Clearly choices were made about its contents. And Bill is wondering if you could say a little bit more about those choices and who made them, when, why, etc.
Yeah, definitely. The photo archives, the Albuquerque Museum is a municipal museum, so It is run by the city of Albuquerque. So we are government. The way that it began is through donations, and we still are run in that way. We have very limited budgets to go out and purchase anything. So we're really reliant upon community members to, when they find things, to offer them up for donation. And we have really generous community members in that way. I would say at the very beginning, before there was a photo archive though, the earliest director actually started trying to build the collection by purchasing copies of photographs from other collecting institutions, which has caused problems, obviously now. But we had several photographs, from Library of Congress, for instance, which is a free government collection. But you know, what are we really going to do with those when they're actually being taken care of? The originals are being taken care of elsewhere. So we did have to really, as a staff, try to figure out who are we and what are we going to collect. And one thing in particular with the city of Albuquerque is we are overwhelmingly blessed with collecting institutions, and they all have different missions. So up the street from the Albuquerque Museum is the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. Down the street is the National Hispanic Cultural Center. We do have the University of New Mexico, which has its own photo archive and archive. We also have the public library system, which has a pretty strong collection. So among all of these different institutions and across the city, we try to have a very collegial relationship. And so most of us are donation based. And so when a donor comes in, oftentimes we do have conversations about, can we take these photographs, and would the university take the diaries from this family? And we sort of, as a city, try to share the resources and try to think about, I guess, where the researcher is going to go first, because it's a blessing and a curse to have so many wonderful archives when sometimes our researchers are coming in and they schedule one day to be in Albuquerque to do all their research, and they don't, you don't really like sending them all across the city. But so I hope that answers your question. We're a city, we're a municipal.
Thank you, Jillian. We have a question about where the collages discussed today can be viewed. So the exhibit Artists in the Archives is on view at the Sheldon in Middlebury through the end of this year into the first week of January. So the collages are on view at the museum. There is an exhibition catalog that was produced in conjunction with the exhibit. So if you won't have the opportunity to make it to Middlebury, but are interested in the whole suite of images that was produced, there is a catalog that I believe is available for purchase through the Sheldon Museum and also through Cassini House. And we hope that some of you may be able to make it up to Middlebury to see them in person. I personally have not had the opportunity to see the exhibit installed in person yet. So I'm excited for a few weeks when I will have the opportunity to do that. And we have one more question, and then I think we will wrap up for this evening. So to the artists who are with us tonight, how do you think this project might influence your work going forward?
For me, as I mentioned, I really wanted to take this residency because I'm about to embark on a very large family collage project, of course, that could take years, right? It could be ongoing as we uncover more and more information and images. So how it's gonna, I mean, working, I had, to be honest, I had done a few original works, and it looked like I was scrapbooking. It was awful. So I was so happy to see how other people within this residency, Carmen included, how they worked with archival images. It really was inspirational. So it very much influenced me in that I feel a lot more confident about representing my own family now and any other, like, again, thinking outside of the box. It's gonna show me to, or help me to play a bit more before I actually lay things down. And that the sky's the limit for ideas. It doesn't have to be so, sometimes factually based, and sometimes just it can be a lot more playful and still convey the information that I want it to.
For me, working with one image, well, 1.5 images, was very challenging because I'm so used to having a plethora of things to pull from. But what it gave me was the ability to understand that everything is in the gaze. It's not the object. It's not so much like the subject matters so much, but the gaze in which you see it. And I didn't understood that. I thought I just needed a lot of things. I didn't understand that until I had to deal with the restraints in which I was placed. And I had to figure out also how to transform myself into a place that wasn't available to me. Like, I wanted to go to the museum so I could feel the vibe and I could feel how I can deal with this project. But the fact that the restraints were not only because I had one photograph, it was because I also didn't know the space, you don't know the people that I was dealing with. It was a very naked situation in terms of how we were speaking about ourselves and speaking about absence in our lives and absence in society and in our own group of people, and how that translated into what we were doing there. It was very inspirational. I've learned a lot, so much. I mean, Ginger's ability to be such a researcher, I wish I would have that, but that's so admirable because it's not just a beautiful object that she created, it's a historical manuscript almost, you know, and you know, and it's wonderful. But in general, even you know, everyone, I just learned so much about myself, about what I'm really looking at, about looking inwards to pitch out outwards, because that's all I had. And I really was inside of that museum, you know, for the time that I could. And that really connected me in terms of community, you know. And speaking about community and connections, I feel very connected to the images that I was working with, to the particular people that I was working with, to the people at the museum that were helping me so much through the process of grieving because I only had one image, and to taking pictures of the interiors. I didn't know this was a collaboration. This was not just, it was a collaboration, you know, in terms of an intellectual collaboration, a physical collaboration. You know, it was I couldn't have done this myself. It would have never occurred to me to work just with one image and start these limitations. But actually that it gave me a lot of freedom in terms of like, how am I looking at this? What is my gaze? So I am very thankful. I thank you all for the opportunity. I couldn't be more grateful. I had a great time. Thank you.
Me too.
So I just wanted to thank everybody who lasted till this very moment with us, and express my gratitude beyond words to all of you, the artists, you know, Ginger and Carmen and Young, who wasn't here, and also to Jill, to make me feel like I'm not alone in the world, because it's a very lonely world dealing with archives and collections, and without all of you we wouldn't be able to create this incredible project and really community of friends and like thinking people, which is so wonderful to know that you all exist. And of course to Taylor for sticking with me for all these months and beyond. Someone mentioned women, and next month on December 14 we'll have another webinar which will focus on women in the archive. So please again check our website, log in. We also are thinking about extending webinars into spring. There will be artists who are based in Europe who will be offering their perspective. We are thinking about one webinar focusing on community and landscape and a couple of other topics. There is also a slight chance that we may extend this exhibit beyond January, because we are thinking that we just scratched the surface and there is so much content which still can be explored and brought to public attention. So hopefully it will work out and we'll keep you posted. So thank you so much to everybody and good night.
Good night.
Night.